The question how the F-hole arose and where it got its shape has finally been answered by carefully studying representations of violins in visual arts from the 16th to the 18th century. The F-holes, just like the rest of the violin, were not the result of a brilliant design by some marvelously inventive genius. It originated around 1500 at the court of Isabella d'Este from a visual concept, building further on something already existing, namely the C-hole. The latter is, as it were, cut off in half at an angle or even straight, both halves then being rotated relative to each other and finally stitched back together. The result is a notch on both sides pointing away from the small circle at the end of the same side. That is why F-holes have indents and why the inner one is placed lower than the outer one. That is also the reason why these inner notches were not, as often assumed, initially used as a reference for locating the bridge. The abutting surface is sometimes so small that the origin, namely 2C halves, is undeniable. On the other hand, by increasing the interface one can create a larger opening in the middle, and sometimes the distance between the two indents is extreme. This origin is further stressed by the fact that in 17th century iconography the indentations, as offshoots of the C halves, are usually asymmetrical and in mirror image relative to each other, contrary to modern violin making. The uniformity between above and below was a constant feature. The diameter of the closing circle could vary, but was 4 times the same per instrument. Typical as well is the sharp angles where the long sides meet the circles. The so-called wings of the sound holes initially didn't end in a straight line as is common nowadays. This type of sound hole, linked to other archaic features on violins, will dominate the appearance of the violin family for about a century, between around 1550 and 1650, from the Augsburg Treaty in 1555 until the Munster and Westphalia treaties of 1648. Initially, the F-hole was very suitable to the new contour of the top with its constrictions, with the lower circles pointing to the edges and the upper ones to each other. For the bridge there was now plenty of space between the holes. If required, one could put it far down towards the tailpiece, which was often desirable given the long string length needed for the lower notes, since the quality of clear-gut strings was still in its infancy. At this time the bridge still had no fixed place, and notches, if they were present, were merely the product of an aesthetic evolution. So they were not, as often assumed, designed as a reference for locating the bridge. Before 1800, most bridges didn't stand between the indents, as statistics based on representations from the 17th and 18th centuries indicate. Also in 1756 Leopold Mozart described an ideal, an ambition more than a fact, when he stated that the bridge had its place in the middle between the two cutouts. The sound holes of instruments attributed to Andrea Amati closely resemble the archaic type we described, but are innovative as far as the wings near the approximately identical circles are cut off. While the archaic sound holes gradually disappear after 1650 along with other old characteristics such as sickle-shaped pegs, baluster-shaped tailpieces and long corners, the share of the newer sound hole shapes increases, wider wings, a difference between upper and lower part, and smaller circles at the top. The reason for widening the curve at the bottom is pretty clear. By doing so the F-hole adapts even more to the outline of the top, and thus the freely vibrating section between the sound holes becomes wider. The reason why F-holes were adopted for the violin family may be acoustics, but clearly convention played a role. It was part of the verbiage discerning violins from violins with their Cs and viola d'amores with their whimsical, flame-shaped sound holes. Boat-shaped dancing masters' kits are usually given C-holes with one notch in the middle, derived from an older type, mostly used for viols. This has to do, of course, with a narrow sound box. The bridge is then placed between sound holes and tailpiece, and not, as often thought by analogy with the modern violin, in the middle between the nicks, where usually there is simply not enough room.